Welcome to Zen and the Art of Real Estate Investing. What if you could learn from experienced real estate investors, find out what got them to where they are now, get insight into their daily habits, and take these insights to inspire your own growth? Each week, Jonathan Green shares an in-depth look at the mindful approach to real estate investing. Jonathan is a real estate investor, advisor, and coach, as well as the founder of Streamlined Properties and the team leader of Streamlined Properties on Market, brokered by eXp Realty. Whether you are looking to start from scratch, get to the next level, or just a straightforward and honest approach to real estate investing, Jonathan seeks to provide a free mentorship program you can take with you anywhere. Now, here's Jonathan.
Welcome back to another week of Zen and the Art of Real Estate Investing. It's that time again, and I appreciate you being here 2 times a week now, thanks to all of you listeners. Got a great show for you. But before that, I just want to remind you your normal podcast stuff, like, subscribe, share, ring bells, click buttons, do whatever you need to do that helps us promote the podcast. The best thing to do is just share it with friends who you think would get value out of it. This week, we have DJ McClure from National Flood Experts, and you're about to get a masterclass on flood risk for real estate investors. Stay tuned. You need to hear this. This is episode 87 of Zen and the Art of Real Estate Investing with my guest, DJ McClure. DJ is the VP of Sales and Business Development at National Flood Experts, driving strategic growth through partnerships and tailored cost-saving solutions. National Flood Experts are the #1 resource for flood zone solutions nationwide, and really important topic for investors. DJ, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jonathan. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you about this because I think it's kind of like maybe an afterthought to some investors, and it really shouldn't be. We're going to go through a lot of ways that they can figure this out. So I'm excited to help them get through it with your assistance. But when you were younger, did you have interest in real estate at all?
I did, yeah. I bought my first piece of real estate at 25. Did kind of the crowd thing with roommates and did that for a lot of years. Then I moved away, held it as a rental property for a short period, had some bad experience with property management and sold it. And now wish that I'd held on to it a little bit longer, knowing now wish I knew then what I know now.
Yeah. So you started out as a house hacker with roommates doing the traditional thing. So where do you think you ran into problems with property management? Was that there was none available or that you chose the first one?
I think I chose one of the first ones that I interviewed, and I was actually leaving the country. I took a job. I was working in the tennis industry as a tennis professional at the time. And so I was actually moving out of the country to Puerto Rico, and, having a very long distance property management relationship did not go as great as I would have hoped.
Yeah. Did you realize, though, at the time, being kind of like new to having a property manager, that you still have to manage the manager? I think that's where a lot of the things go crazy.
That's where it totally went south for me. Yeah. We had invoices showing up for hundreds of dollars beyond what they were supposed to, and with no conversation. And come to find out, this particular property manager was one strike away from losing her license. So yeah, we pulled the ejection cord and sold it much, much earlier than I wish that I would have.
Yeah, but that's a common thing. I think a lot of people have gone through that. You just kind of, and once you're out, it's much harder for you to manage and even get rid of the property. So good on you for pulling the cord at the right time, though, because some people could have let the ship sink on that one.
Yes. But lessons learned, and you carry those forward.
Yeah. So how did you get into the flood industry as it relates to real estate?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. When I left the tennis industry, I was looking at just different sales organizations that I could join. And honestly, I met this company just kind of by luck in a way. I saw some information on the company, and I just thought it was really niche, really interesting, and it combined a lot of interests that I had. I love solving problems. That's as a tennis professional, that's what you do, right? You solve a problem for someone's particular game. The next person is entirely different. So transferring that same interest to sales and real estate, I came across National Flood Experts, and they really were a small company at the time. This is 5 years ago now. And it was just very intriguing the way they were kind of attacking this really unknown problem, an unspoken problem that exists within real estate.
Yeah. Do you think that, I mean, when you first start getting wind of it and then learning how people found you, I feel like flood is something that people are just scared of. They just consider it as like, oh, well, you know what, just forget it. And you guys are really able to provide at least one, more transparency on it, and then a lot of different solutions out there for long-term and short-term options.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much taking a disruptor mindset, to the real estate market, because, what I learned really early on, my first 6 months, is that a lot of people don't like flood insurance. Like, we're talking insurance professionals in general, they just don't like it. It's not interesting. It's very complicated. And then real estate investors, just the same, they don't like it, but they will accept it. And they take the lender's word as just written in blood, basically, that, look, they say I got to have flood insurance, so I have to have it. And it kind of just gets, set on renewal. And there's not always as much, deep diving into it as what we're doing. So it's fun to be on the surface of something.
Yeah, it can be a humongous value add to either remove or reduce a flood premium. And that's something that I agree with you. I don't think people think about, like you said, they just take the lender. Oh, well, they require flood insurance. Okay, I'll just pay, $4,300 a year. The one way that I learned about it early in my on-market career is I was doing a deal, and there was like part of the property was in the flood. It was like one of those garage zones. And we ended up challenging it and it got out. And I was like, wow. But I don't know that I really kept paying attention to that. And this is exactly what you're talking about. There's huge benefits in there. Why do you think it is that investors just take the word for it? Is it because it's such a niche thing and it's hard to figure out who to go to get an answer?
I mean, there's just so many things to pay attention to when you're buying a deal. And the flood's just one variable of 1,000 others that you're trying to really do due diligence on and evaluate. And so a lot of people just say, forget it, I'm not going to look at a flood zone, they just walk away. Or, they go through the process, their broker, they accept whatever that cost is going to be in the underwriting, and they just work around it. And then they never really think about it again. That's a pretty common thing. We meet a lot of investors that are 2-3 years or more into their property, and they're like, wow, I had no idea some of these solutions existed. Wish I'd known when I was going through the buying process.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, maybe it looks like a good deal because it's like a quote, a flood deal. And then the flood premiums are worked into the spreadsheet, it pencils, everything looks good. So like you said, they're like, well, that's just operating costs now. Right. So what's the first indicator to someone that there may be something they can do about a flood premium, or should everybody be checking it to make sure?
Honestly, it's really everybody. There's not really any, fail-safe criteria. I say anyone that has a property, whether they've owned it for however many years or they're looking at buying one, you should just give it a kind of an open mind look, because you don't know what's going to be below the surface. There's literally so many different things that can lead to a cost savings, whether it's, looking at the way the policy is structured, looking at different options, looking at the flood zone. Interestingly enough, flood insurance is the only insurance that you can actually assume ownership from the seller. And a lot of people don't know that. A lot of insurance brokers actually don't know that you can do that too. So if the owner has a favorable price point, now it has to be with NFIP. Doesn't necessarily work for the private markets, unfortunately. But, what's happened is that there's been an evolution in FEMA's insurance program over the last few years. And so there's still some of the, let's call it legacy policy pricing that's out there. And if someone's paying, let's say $1,500 for an apartment building, you may run a brand new quote. That same building might be $10,000. But if you're able to assume the policy from the seller, now you're starting day one at $1,500. And of course, you're going to increase every year, but not nearly at the trajectory of starting at $10,000.
Yeah. I can just see it all clearly in my head. I look at all these people who are losing money by just not even considering it or just accepting it. And also, like you said, a lot of people passing on flood properties, which I'm sure I've done over the years, just say like, oh, well, that sounds like too much trouble instead of really weighing in on it. Let's talk geography first in terms of the flood zones. Obviously, if you see one and it's close to being outside, that's maybe a better indicator that you may have more options there?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think just getting some visibility on the flood map, right? We teach all our investor clients to make pulling the flood zone, part of your due diligence process. I mean, it's pretty simple. You can go to FEMA's, mapping website, throw in the address, and it's pretty visibly obvious. The blue area is the 100-year flood zone. And it's real simple. If it's touching even a small piece of a building, the lenders have a legal compliance that they have to pass on to you that flood insurance will be required for that building. So it really starts, as simply as that. We see a lot of multifamily properties where, out of 20 buildings, there may only be 5 that the flood zone is touching. And you're like, how does that make sense, right? Water didn't just stop, and topography, right? The world's not flat. So there's, you have to just kind of question it and go a little deeper. And that's where, some of the fun, solutions really exist.
Yeah. And I think people also get this thing in their head that flood zone means every property floods, which obviously is not true, because there's property not in flood zones that flood, properties in flood zones where you may never flood, but they're hedging their bets based on topography and everything like that. That's why the insurance exists, right?
Yeah, I mean, the flood zones are created and maintained by the local counties around the country, right? So, yeah, FEMA does oversee at the final national level, but each individual county is, managing and updating their maps. Some are every 10 years, some are even more 15 to 20 years, right? So by the time a new flood map comes out, they're using data from several years past. And development, real estate construction, all those things move way faster. So you have to really understand the requirements and then take the steps necessary to see, what can be done potentially if the data allows you to then maybe get the lender requirement removed or, perhaps have a better policy.
Yeah, I'm going to ask the question I know people want to hear, and we talked about it quickly just in the pre-call. Is climate change now affecting the kind of the whole area of flood now more than it was before in terms of insurance setting for investors?
Definitely on the property side, right? Everyone that's buying a property right now or owns a property has seen massive increases on the property side. All the property carriers are private, right? So they dictate their own criteria of what they will and won't insure. Now, through FEMA's program, it's a little bit different. Pretty much anybody can get a policy through FEMA. There's few criteria where they'll exclude you. But what they've done, FEMA introduced their risk rating 2.0 evolution of the insurance system. And what they did is they essentially used a similar mindset to the private market where it's a little more subjective. Certain areas of the country have had more claims. Certain areas of the country have a higher saturation of policies. So they tried to spread around a little bit. Certain areas of the country are now more expensive than they used to be. Whereas in the past, there was a very predictable criteria to the way they priced the FEMA insurance policies. I mean, think of just like this big spreadsheet of scenarios. Even for the low risk flood zones, there used to be standard pricing. Well, now they don't use the flood zone as a multiplier anymore in the FEMA policies. And so there's a little more subjectivity in at least the perception of the way it looks. So yeah, some of the areas of the country are definitely getting a little more penalized than others.
Yeah, and that's based on weather anomalies that have come and gone or claims that they've had to pay out, right?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think a lot of investors are thinking like definitely climate change is going to play a role for a lot of investors now. But, being able to talk to professionals who can at least hedge the bets and make it, like we said in the beginning, more transparent makes it a lot easier to say like, hey, well, look, if 50% of people are scared of flood zone properties, doesn't that make it an opportunity for investors? And that's exactly who you guys can help the most, right?
Yeah, I tell people there's a lot of hidden NOI in the flood zones. When you really start looking below the surface. With the way that people are moving around the country, there's a lot of shifting to markets. And, there's really high demand, but there's been low transactions. And so right now, everyone is really trying to find cost savings in every area possible. And so the flood policy is definitely one that gets just kind of forgotten. Everyone really focuses on the property programs because those are such the big ticket items. So the conversations have really evolved, especially now with a lot of the property programs for these bigger investors. Some of those master programs include a line item for some flood coverage. And so you have to really get creative nowadays. You have to think like an investor, to think like a flood engineer, to think like an insurance broker, all at the same time in the conversation, and ask a lot of good questions to try to figure out, maybe the same solution for you may have a different impact for somebody else. And it's that creativity in the conversation where, you figure out what the value is.
Yeah, that's another great point to what you were saying before. I mean, I think that there's more leverage inside flood quotes and opportunity, like you said, NOI or value add opportunities than people think. So it's not as static as we all thought, where it's just like flood premium. You either take it or leave it. There's a lot of other options that we're going to go through that make it. Are like new builders for new builds, is that more beneficial now when people can do new construction knowing that there's maybe an adjustment in what FEMA is doing? Does that help them stay ahead of the curve versus areas that maybe became more in a flood zone, but are still built, a different way?
Well, look at what we're seeing around the country, right? There's a ton of development and, more of the outer urban markets, these tertiary markets in a way that are areas that, in a few years are going to be very dense. But when the flood maps perhaps were, produced, 5, 7, 10 years ago, they were considered rural areas.
Right.
So you have a lot of flood maps that are essentially unfinished. They don't give you a lot of information as to what the flood elevation might be. And so there's a lot of those projects that we're seeing now where developers are going into these areas, they're creating density and they're running into flood zones. And so part of that is really tackling it from the beginning, trying to understand what's the current topography in relation to what we think the flood elevation might be, because the permitting is going to require you to build above it. And so it's figuring out, okay, can we move around some of the existing topography? Can we bring in some dirt? What things can we do that are A, cost effective, but B, create a huge return on investment? Maybe it's the developer that wants to build it, lease it up, sell it as quickly as possible. Maybe it's somebody that wants to title the land, get the site plans approved and such, and then sell it to, the actual builder. All these things, when you get the flood zone taken out of the equation, at least as much as possible, that's huge value.
Yeah, or plan for it appropriately, because then you're so much farther ahead. Your value is going to be greater if that floodplain does come this way. You've already prepared for it.
Right.
Your premiums aren't going to get adjusted like everybody else who was like, ooh, flood zone, I never knew that was coming.
That's right.
Yeah. There's a lot more money in it than even I thought before we got on the call. So yeah, I'm really excited about this. What are some just general value add solutions for properties in flood zones for both commercial and residential owners who maybe they already own one in a flood zone and they want to figure out what to do to figure out how to get more income?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most common solutions is when you're able to get the flood zone changed. So our engineers go through a process with FEMA. It's called a letter of map amendment, or LOMA. You'll hear it also called. And that's a federal document that is specific to either a number of buildings, could also be like a meets and bounds area of land or around a property. And what that does is it changes the flood zone from 100-year to an X, right? So the low risk flood zone. And in being a federal document, all the federal lending institutions, including Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, those same programs, at that point, they no longer have a compliance requirement for the flood insurance. And
wow. Okay.
That doesn't mean that you cannot continue to carry flood insurance, but now you don't have a lender dictating the coverage limits, right? We were having a conversation yesterday with an investor that they've got to carry $30 million in flood insurance for a particular large multifamily. I mean, we're talking, they're way north of 100,000 in what they're paying.
Yeah.
So, obviously the dollars can add up, but then once you no longer have a lender requirement, then all sorts of options open up. And for some, they choose to drop the flood insurance, right? They want to hedge the risk themselves. And that's immediate dollar savings, obviously. But then we have clients that will use this as a way to leverage a higher cash out for their refinance. Well, right now, in some cases, it's reducing the amount of cash you have to pay in to refinance, right?
Yeah.
Who would have thought that would have been a term a few years ago? But we've had a lot of investors that they've been able to use the flood zone amendment to bring the value up so that the numbers will pencil a little bit better going into the refi. But then also the MAP amendments, they live with the property. So when you sell this, if I sell one to you, you're buying a property that does not have a flood insurance requirement.
I mean, that's a huge asset to the property and definitely something great for marketing at the time. Hey, it's Jonathan. This is just a brief interlude to talk to you about Deal Machine. Listen, I've used Deal Machine and I was crushing it with my Concerned Citizen postcard on Deal Machine. You can look that video up on my YouTube and find out how I did it. It works. Deal Machine works. I've had David Lecco, the CEO, on the podcast. So if you want a free trial of Deal Machine, the elite Driving for Dollars app, and I'm telling you, it works if you use it correctly, you can go to my link at bit.ly/Zen Deal Machine. Now, bit.ly is bit.ly/Zen Deal Machine. It's free and you'll be up and running in 2 minutes, and then you can figure out if you want to keep it. Let's get back to the show. One thing that I was thinking when you were saying this is that you could really create, if you just had one property, whether it be small, just a single family, multi, or even a commercial, and you do all this due diligence and you find out that you can move it from like 100 plane to X, you don't have to go tell everyone, but you could be buying the properties all next door that still think they're in the 100, knowing that you already had this discussion and you know where it's going to go. You could make huge deals on all those properties. Is that like a good idea for people who then get one? They should immediately be looking if they can get deals on the other ones because all those people think they are in a worse area.
Yeah, we definitely find a lot of solutions in density.
Yeah.
We had a project several years ago. It was a industrial park, a lot of warehouse, industrial type buildings. We ended up doing like 20 projects all in the same area. They'd all been built around the same time. And there was one investor that owned, maybe like 7 or 10 buildings. And then, we just met the neighboring owners, and within 3-4 months, all the projects were pretty much done. So we have the same type of mentality with our multifamily investors, with our self-storage guys. And so I think it's a great thing to keep in your pocket, and it's a savvy strategy.
Yeah. I mean, I really like it. My wheels are turning. I mean, even for cash investors, of course, they don't have to go get flood insurance, but do you find that a lot of cash investors are still obviously protecting themselves? But this is where I can see the option, because then you can look at those houses next door where you have leverage both with cash and knowledge of the flood opportunity there to make deals right in the same area.
Yeah, we see a lot of investors where they will, go into a deal all cash. Maybe, 1 to 2 years later, they've done some type of value increase and they want to then hedge that value, pull some cash out against it to go use it to buy their next asset. Well, obviously, when they bought the property, the flood zone wasn't even a talking point. But when they go into the refi, they start pulling all the flood zone determinations on the lender side. Sure enough, now you've got this expense that they're using against you in the valuation. So yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that you don't really know that it's going to kind of come up and bite you until it does.
Yeah. So let's talk about some ways to get a property removed from the flood zone. I know we went in a little. Are there other ways besides just general geography? Like I said before, I know if you see one and it's on there, that's like a better challenge. But are there other like things that are going on, like you said, with the delay and how long it takes to develop these flood zones, where people should be checking if they're, somewhat close to where there's a clean zone?
Yeah, I mean, it's really in all the different areas, right? Some of the wins that we have is, the corner of a building just barely being touched.
Yeah.
And then you've got areas like New Orleans where, the entire area of Metairie is in a flood zone, and we've done 30 plus projects. So
Wow. Okay.
it's really about how the property was built. And then, so we're taking building specific details, we're doing a flood zone analysis, and it's all objective engineering, right? So there's literally all these different analyses that we're going through. And when the data works, we present that to FEMA and say, look, here's our engineering to prove that this particular building or number of buildings, meets their criteria to be excluded from this 100-year flood zone. And so at that point, our win rate's basically 99% that FEMA is going to then approve it.
So construction of the building has more weight than maybe some of us have thought compared to just the map. In my head, I always thought like, well, it's just wherever the flood zone says, that's just there. But there's things about these composition of buildings that can affect what the rates are over time.
Well, if we're talking about the flood zone specifically, yeah, I mean, there's all the different variables really come into play together. When you're talking about the policies specifically, they've really changed the way they're weighing the variables. So you've got, let's just say 18 plus variables that they're using, to calculate this premium. Some of them are like, proximity to water, how many floors the building has, so some of those demographics do have an impact. What type of building are we talking about? One that's, got slab on grade? Are we talking an elevated building? So all these different things have an impact. And so then we're also looking at, well, how do these different variables together work with, the other engineering of the flood zone and such, and how all this comes together to then create that end premium calculation. So the consulting on the policy that we do is similar. Our engineers, they understand the insurance world for flood as well as anybody. And you're really just breaking down all these variables and seeing what the data allows you to do.
Yeah, I mean, if like you said, if there's 18 variables and then you have experts looking at all 18, seeing where there's a plus or minus, and you find just a few pluses, that can make huge amount of money, over the years. That's a great point. I also think I guess I always thought like flood zones meant huge water sources, rivers, oceans. And then, I became a licensed agent like 10 years ago, pulled up the flood map. I was like, what the hell is this?
Yeah.
I'm in like a middle of a suburban town and there's like 18 different flood zones. So this is something that people might not even know about, how close they are to flood zones and how those flood zones work. Because I see them just on small rivers, but maybe over time those can grow. It's interesting. Do you find a lot of people who just had no idea how many actual flood zones there are in each town?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's lots of infrastructure, right, that these, cities and counties put in place, to counteract, any type of, flood risk. And so some things you don't even really notice. It could be a ditch that has never seen water to your history, but there's obviously a threshold at which that can, control the flow of water. And when things get outside of that criteria, all right, where do they think water will go? And so a lot of the flood maps are trying to estimate as best possible, within certain scenarios. You get things like hurricanes with massive storm surges that are far outside any criteria that a flood map could predict. That's obviously when things get a little bit tragic, and you see 100-year low risk flood zones, like everything in between taking on water. But those are more extreme scenarios. But yeah, that's why you have to really put some eyes on it, because you really never know. There could be a flood zone, in your backyard.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's definitely going to open a lot of eyes to people, I think, who are just saying as a hard no to flood insurance and flood zones in general, to think about it a little bit more, see what they can do. So over your years in the flood industry, you actually develop relationships that helped you grow a new, not like the first property, a new investment portfolio. Tell us about that a little bit as well, because I love relationships in real estate. And I like how we were talking before, how now you've built up this portfolio through a lot of the contacts you made from your job.
Yeah, I mean, I became an LP investor 3 years ago, just kind of slowly, built a portfolio of projects. And a lot of the projects were with, people that we had done, flood consulting projects in the past. And so people I got to know through conferences and, you really kind of see and watch, what's somebody's mentality to the way that they're operating their deals. How open-minded are they to different alternative value-add solutions? How do they hedge risk? All those different things that you're really just kind of watching. Nobody knows you're watching. And
Right.
then, there was a ton of deal flow in the last couple of years, a lot more than this year, of course.
Yeah.
So I, dove into the pool and, just trying to learn as much as I can, every year. And, I've got some projects I'm almost 3 years into now. And obviously we have some challenges that we couldn't have predicted 3 years ago that we're facing. And so, yeah, it's a crash course education for sure.
Yeah. So these properties that you are investing in now, those are all in Dallas, right?
Most of them are in Texas. Yeah, I'd say the biggest part of my portfolio is in Dallas, some in Houston, and then have a few other projects that are, kind of spread nationally on the retail side. But yeah, I mean, I like markets with, growing populations and markets with, big industries moving in that create jobs. And obviously a lot of the same, foundational variables that most are looking at.
Yeah. I mean, but you obviously use all this data and stuff that you know about flood that can affect markets. But so from a flood perspective and an investor perspective, are there any markets where you're like, I mean, I wouldn't go there? Or is it just like, hey, there's premiums on that? That's the whole point of having flood insurance.
I think now 5 years in, we've done projects in, I think, 46 states around the country. So it's opened my eyes a lot. I don't think there's any bad markets necessarily. It's just really doing the due diligence, right? So if you're going into a property, it doesn't matter where it is. It doesn't matter what type of property it is. Getting a bit of history on the property, right? So even let's take all this aside that we're talking about with the value add, just doing a little bit of due diligence into what's the worst that's ever happened to that property in the last, however long you can learn. Maybe it's from a neighbor, maybe it's from a broker that really knows that area. Has that property ever even been close to taking on water? And if it did, what was the proximity? And so getting some of that criteria, like that seems so obvious and so simple, but just asking those questions and then using that information in combination with the other things we talked about, now you've got a little bit more, information to make a good decision.
Yeah, I get a lot of the questions I've asked have been focused on the small scale, but for commercial real estate, like the larger scale the property and units, the more important all this that we're talking about really can be, because the savings can be astronomical. So you were saying before, as an LP, you learned about risk tolerance from these people to figure out what deals you want to go into. That was a really great point, because I think if you're seeing GPs who are running deals as syndicators and they're really hyper focused on this type of stuff, it means they're hyper focused on everything, right? Is that where you're going with that? Tell us more about that, because I think that's a great insight from you as an investor, using what you know to say like, wow, these people look like they're looking into the right things.
100%. Yeah, there's so many ways to increase NOI on a property if you look for it. Now, not everything applies to every property, but it's the mindset that's more important than anything, right? Is someone willing to go and be creative, be curious, ask questions, build networks of resources? We're just one of all the different things out there. But if you look for it, you'll find it. And so that mindset's important to me. And, you can look at obviously the history that operators have had, how many exits have they had?
Yeah.
All those typical questions, but it's getting a little deeper than that for me. And like I said, most of the people that I know, I've met publicly, and how someone carries themselves in front of an audience or among others can tell you a lot too.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. I think it's a good way to vet people who are looking to do well for the LPs instead of just themselves. Like the deal then works for everybody if you uncork one of these things where you're like, wow, that savings could be dramatic. And that's a trickle-down effect over the years that the syndication's active.
It's so hard right now. There's so much advertising going on, and LinkedIn's just flooded with good marketers.
Yeah.
And, if you don't know the difference, it's easy to kind of get bought into the excitement and the IRRs that people are advertising. If you don't know, like, some of those things are just really unrealistic, I think. But obviously, high risk, high reward sometimes. So Everyone is just got to have their own criteria, I think, and then have some discipline to that criteria. And if your criteria matches up to that of what the GP is offering, then yeah, you'll be great partners. But it's the ones that stretch a little bit. Those are going to be the deals that are going to get grabbed up in the next 6 months when all this short-term debt starts maturing, and it's going to get a little bit hostile out there.
Yeah, and I think there's creative ways of looking to increase NOI and reduce costs like this by doing due diligence on actual factors that can be verified by agencies who can say, hey, now we're going to put you into a different thing than other people who are cost cutting that may come back to haunt you later. These are verified, scalable ways. If you can save it now, it's verified and done. Like, you don't have to go back and do it. I really like this. I think it's going to help a lot of people get to it. In terms of commercial real estate life cycles, there are some strategies that you guys will go over that can reduce or eliminate flood insurance costs. Not, I guess, not as a whole, but over time. Is that something that's like available in terms of just running down the life cycle of a commercial property?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's a question we always ask when we're talking is, what's the history and what's the future of this particular asset? Do we know a refinance is coming in the next 12, 18 months? All right, well, let's talk about that. What solutions, can help make the biggest impact there? Are they planning to sell the asset in 12 months? Is this something they're going to hold for 10 years? Like, all those kind of change the way we look at the situation. And also, when we do uncover a solution, it helps us figure out, like, does that solution even match what they're trying to do? Sometimes we'll review a property, we'll find something positive, but it doesn't necessarily fit their current situation, and nothing moves forward. But we'll get calls back 12 months later and saying, all right, something's changed.
Yeah.
Now I've decided to do this, and now that solution that we had, kind of in our pocket from before, now it's relevant. So, this is where we look at hundreds of properties every month all over the country. We find a solution about half the time, if you can believe it. And then it's a good conversation. Let me put on my investor hat. Let me put on my insurance broker, thinking hat. Let me think like an engineer, and let's figure out, is there something here that's worthwhile?
Yeah, I mean, even for me, it's really enlightening because I think coming into this recording, I was thinking like, oh, well, geography, you just figure out what's close. But now what you said about going through the actual policy, that's huge to me because I know, like, you just get a policy. The insurance broker may not even know, all the things, the questions that you're asking now. So to have someone to go through each point, like knowing even though you're in the middle of a flood zone, like you're not getting out of the flood zone, but there's still things that you can do. That's a really enlightening point of view for investors who own flood zone properties and maybe have just been doing what we said before. Well, cost of doing business. But what if the cost of doing business could be a lot better?
Yeah.
And that means you could get another property or get something else going or buy another property in the area knowing what other people don't. Really good.
It's taking a proactive mindset, really. That you could summarize everything in that statement, really. This is why we work with a lot of insurance brokers, right? So we partner with them. Our clients a lot of times will introduce us to their brokers, and we try to then take that same mindset, work as a resource for them to help their other clients. And it's just about getting this education to continue to circulate. And we do all these property reviews at no cost, right? So there's literally no harm, no foul to have one of our experts put a set of eyes on the property. And then that's what it's about, trying to find things that maybe you didn't plan for in your business plan that gives you that surprise value increase for the years to come.
Can you guys do those reviews at no plan? Because you're so oftentimes going to find a solution that becomes a no-brainer for people, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So there's a couple documents that we gather, and our team does a desktop review from here in Tampa. We've got a field team that we can deploy as needed. That's the only time our clients have any kind of upfront costs, just to cover basically our travel.
Yeah.
But I mean, we've got a 70% hit rate on the field work, right? So we're telling the clients, like, look, we think this is a better than 50% chance. So we don't want someone to just waste money on field work. But we'll give them our honest opinion of what we think the likelihood and the outcome is. Fly our team to Eugene, Oregon, recently, or California, East Coast, everywhere in between. And then we bring all that data back in-house. We go back through the analysis again and, see what type of fun stuff we can uncover.
Yeah. And again, I mean, you're really betting on yourselves and your guys' experience in the business, knowing that, like, listen, we have all these different areas that we're going to look at, including geography, topography, documents, insurance, everything before, and the rate of claims that have come before. That's somewhere in there. You're going to be able to find something that's going to help them. It makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's a fun puzzle. They're all the situations are different. Could be a warehouse, could be an apartment property, could be a hotel, could be a condo. Like, there's solutions that apply across the board that it doesn't matter what type of property owner you are, it's still worth, giving it a thought. And now right? So that's information that you have for the next deal and the next deal that have in your pocket.
Yeah. So for a brand new investor who walks up and they're looking at a flood zone property for the first time, they don't really know what they're doing, but that starts to scare them. What advice would you give them? I know we've given them a bunch, but let's go all the way down to like the basics. Should you be scared of the flood zone property that you see?
Yeah, think of it like a due diligence checklist, right? So you've got a couple more bullet points, that you want to make sure you're evaluating. So get a copy of the seller's flood insurance policy. Pull up the property on the flood map yourself, because remember, you might have some cash investors. So the seller may say, I don't pay any flood insurance, or maybe their lender missed a handful of buildings, which we see all the time. So you want to get their policies, but then you want to kind of look it up yourself and see if they match, right? If there's more than one building. And then from that, start looking at, all right, what do I think the cost might be? And you can use the seller's numbers as a starting point. And does that sway your underwriting in a direction that you're uncomfortable with? But then if you do go under contract, now you're in due diligence, right? So you got that, 30-day window to work with. That's a good time to have, somebody like us take a look, go through all the data, see what's possible. And then again, ask yourself that same question. Does this, if there is something positive, does that change, your mind or your underwriting in any way? And be comfortable with whatever decision it is. We always say we don't want any kind of solution that we're doing. We don't want that to be the one straw that's like getting the deal across the finish line.
Right.
It's got to pencil in all the other ways first. We want what we're doing to be kind of a bonus.
Yeah, I think that's safer too for an investor to know, like, hey, you don't want to, well, I'm just going to get this deal because these guys saved me this much, in insurance. It has to be that thing where, hey, that's just going to be a huge ancillary benefit down the road as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we'll have cases where, everything's moving forward, everything's good. We'll actually execute the solutions during that latter part of the closing process to where, if it's a map amendment project, everything's finished and approved. And we'll have investors where they arrive at closing with no flood insurance requirement. And obviously they can still purchase it just the same, but it's different on the balance sheet when the lender is counting it against you versus when they're not. And then you do something electively after you take possession. So again, it's all strategic with the timing of things. And does that help you get higher loan proceeds, perhaps, if the splash is big enough?
Yeah.
So it's, like I said, it's a fun puzzle, lots of questions to ask, and, just see what we can do.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like investors, we've done a lot of shows on taxes and ways you can save in your taxes. And I really feel like this is overlooked. And this is something that could save people a lot of money and also give them opportunity to get more properties at discounts. Because how many discount options have there been really in the last year? Everything's selling at a premium. So, but some people are scared of flood, it just gives you a strategic advantage.
And on the seller side, right? To kind of flip the coin.
Great point.
We've had sellers where we've really helped them to be able to defend their selling price.
Yeah.
Because if you go to list a property and then the buyers, they find out about the flood zone, they want to use that as a negotiating tool to get a better price, right? Naturally. Well, if maybe you're able to get it out of the flood zone, or maybe you have something else that you can use to say, actually, here's why. And here's the benefit, and here's how it's going to transition to you. Definitely gives the sellers a little more power as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. We were focused mostly on buying, but I mean, I think that's a huge leverage for a sellers to say like, I mean, hey, we've done the due diligence. It's like if you have a structural problem in your house and you just like say, I'll just let them figure it out. Then they didn't know about it, so they think it's way worse than it is. If you know, everyone knows you're in a flood zone. So if you've combated that and said, well, here's all the due diligence we've done, this is what our premium is, and disclose all that, you're really setting yourself up for something good instead of trying to, we see a lot of things on the market and then you run it and you're like, it's in a flood zone. Why didn't they just say that in the agent notes at least? Like, come on, like we're going to be able to figure it out. I think that's crazy. Me as a licensed agent, I don't know why all agents aren't running it for their buyers and sending them in advance, because you could be making offers only to find out later, oops, it's in a flood zone. And then you look stupid as an agent that you didn't look it up.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think you know the answer to that one. Not everybody's,
low bar entry.
Sure.
All right, DJ, the best place for people to get in touch with you guys is at nationalfloodexperts.com.
That's right.
Yeah, and people can just go in and they can do it on small scale, large scale, any type of properties.
That's right. Yeah, you can go to the website. You can put in some information if you want our team to do a property review. You can also send an email to info@nationalfloodexperts.com. And one of our team will respond same day, generally with connecting with one of our sales team to be able to facilitate getting the property looked at.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I think this is going to be a huge eye-opener to people. It's very, very savvy investors who probably never really thought about this stuff. So really appreciate you coming on the show.
No, I'm excited. Thank you very much for sharing this, hopefully impactful education.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. That was DJ McClure, the VP of Sales and Business Development at National Flood Experts. They're at nationalfloodexperts.com. I'm Jonathan Green. We'll see you next week. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Zen and the Art of Real Estate Investing with me, Jonathan Green. And I just want to remind you, and this is always an uncomfortable part, I don't want you to think that I'm begging for you to like, subscribe, follow, do whatever you have to do for the podcast, leave a 5-star review. But if you like the podcast and you think it adds value in the real estate investing sphere, then just do me a personal favor. Like the podcast, follow it, share it when you can with your friends, and be so kind as to write a 5-star review if you believe it deserves a 5-star review up against what else is out there. I would really appreciate it, and I hope you keep listening.